So one of my main struggles with OCD is my emetophobia, which is the fear of vomit. And I have struggled with that since childhood. Panic attacks, it would, affect my fear of traveling. I've heard other parents tell stories like they're holding their kid when they're sick and they throw up on their shoulder and they clean them up and get them back to bed. And that is was my worst nightmare. And I felt bad. That was just not the type of mom that I wanted to be. Yeah. And so that is something that really drove me to seek therapy. And the other day my kids were throwing up and I held my littlest on my lap and I snuggled him. Mm-hmm. And I was so proud of myself. It seems like a little thing, but I was like, this is a big milestone for me. Going through ERP we've mostly been focusing on my emetophobia. It's an example for how I can apply it in everything else in my life.
Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to another episode of the Get to Know OCD podcast. I'm Patrick McGrath, the Chief Clinical Officer for NOCD. And today, Dr. Taylor is joining us, and she has the Growing Intuitive Eaters channel. And I would love to hear a little bit about that and your work with pediatric dietetics and nutrition. You're going into a doctorate in that area, which not a lot of people go all that way. So that's really exciting for me because I love a PhD. I got one. I like them, they're fun. So tell us a little bit about you and kind of what got you into doing all of that.
Sure. So I'm a pediatric dietitian, a nutrition PhD. I'm a mom of 3, and I specialize in helping parents raise their kids to be intuitive eaters. And I also talk a lot about breaking the cycle of disordered eating. I know a lot of millennial parents struggled with disordered eating growing up and want better for their kids. So that's something I focus on. I share a lot of evidence-based nutrition information for kids, and I like to be a source of evidence-based information on the internet because I know there's a lot of things that are not evidence-based.
I don't know what you're talking about. The internet is only true. I don't know what you're saying.
Right. I also, one of my passions is making information accessible to parents. So I have 6 courses on pediatric nutrition, ranging from starting solids, feeding kids with ADHD, picky eating, raising intuitive eaters, constipation, and more. And all of them are free. So that's the kind of core of my business is all the information, ebooks, handouts, courses, everything is 100% free for parents. So I love connecting with them online, and that's pretty much how I spend most of my time.
Awesome. I don't have children, but I see them around. And I'm just curious, how did chicken nuggets become the most important food group to children in the world?
Well, they're delicious. So can you blame them?
Okay.
Because I very much enjoy them too.
Oh, that's fun. Well, there's a lot to talk about that because there is relationships to what you described and obsessive compulsive disorder, especially around ARFID, right? Where we have restricted food intake issues. And sometimes people talk about orthorexia, this idea of I'll only eat things that are really, really healthy and everything else is bad for me, and the interplay with that. And I'm not giving anything away because you've talked about this already, but you come to the table also with your own OCD concerns and
I do
have gone through treatment for that and used exposure and response prevention therapy as well.
Yes, I have OCD and I also have ADHD, and I fairly newly diagnosed with OCD. That was when I was pregnant with my 3rd baby, but I've known I had OCD since high school. I just never really pursued a diagnosis or therapy for it until my adult life. And I'm also a late diagnosed ADHD. And I, was always getting talks too much on my report card in school. But I actually didn't get diagnosed with ADHD until about 2 years ago. So it's very validating to finally get the diagnosis. And it also was really helpful to kind of learn more about myself and find things that work best for me. So
as much as you're comfortable, how has OCD kind of played a role in your life through today?
Oh my gosh, so much. So, one of my main struggles with OCD is my emetophobia, which is the fear of vomit. And I have
Mm.
struggled with that since childhood. I've struggled with panic attacks. It would, affect my fear of like traveling. Like I would be afraid people would throw up on the airplane or people would throw up in the car if we went on a road trip. It would sometimes affect the way I eat or where I eat, not quite to the extent where it caused like disordered eating problems. But I, also have like contamination OCD. And so I
Mm.
struggled with like excessive hand washing and it was definitely challenging when I had kids because kids are really germy
I've
and
heard,
they
yeah,
get
they're
sick
like
all the
petri
time.
dishes of death
Yeah.
sometimes, aren't they? I mean,
Yes.
yes.
Yes. And of
So,
course, as someone with emetophobia, two of my children had vomiting disorders when they
mm,
were babies.
well, that's good
So
ERP
my
right
husband,
there. Yeah, there you go.
totally.
Yeah.
It's totally
Mm,
like an in
mm,
vivo exposure. Two of my kids had FPIES, which is food protein induced enterocolitis syndrome. It's a rare type of food allergy that's
mm.
characterized by delayed vomiting. So the kid will eat the trigger food, and then like 2 to 4 hours later, they'll have like projectile exorcist style vomiting. And so that was definitely challenging for me to navigate
Mhm.
that. And then my daughter, my eldest daughter, she had FPIES. She also had a laryngeal cleft, which is a birth defect in her airway that caused her to aspirate, and so she
Mm,
would get
mm.
like things in her lungs, and she was sick all the time. Like it was crazy how much she was sick. You think your kid gets sick when they go to daycare? It's like that magnified by a lot. And so that was really hard because our family was like constantly sick for
Sure.
over a year, and it was really hard for me like to not over clean and not overwash, and I don't want it to like trickle down to them. So like if I'm like freaking out that somebody hasn't washed their hands, I want to like still be calm for my kids so that they don't like absorb that fear of unwashed hands, for example. Um, and then probably the hardest part about my OCD and parenting was my pregnancy because of how much nausea I had and morning sickness. My OCD was almost paralyzing at that point. And I actually didn't know how to find a therapist who specialized in OCD. I just found like a regular therapist, and
Mm.
we did talk therapy, and it was not very helpful. And because like if you go on like Psychology Today or whatever, like everybody says that they treat OCD, but it's hard to find someone who like actually specializes in OCD. And so I really did not have a good experience my first therapy journey.
Yeah.
She actually did like the eye movement
Mm.
treatments for me, and it's where you like move your eyes back and forth. And because of my OCD, I would count the whole time instead of like actually benefiting from that type of therapy.
Mm.
So I'm really glad now I found OCD. I worked with OCD for an ad on my Instagram recently, but before that, I found OCD through one of my followers. She told me that
Oh.
she used them and sent me
Well,
the
we're
link,
happy.
and yeah, I
We're
know it
happy
was
No
such
CD
a
was helpful
great,
for you. Yeah,
it
that's wonderful.
totally, and
Hmm.
it's really made a difference in my life, like a significant difference. And
Oh,
so
well,
now
that's
I
awesome.
feel like my OCD is finally kind of under control. So it's
Wow,
great.
amazing. Well, I'm thrilled.
Yeah.
I love hearing success stories of the work that we get to do because I'm obviously very passionate about it and want to train a slew of experts in OCD, and
Hmm.
to see it's had a positive impact is wonderful. So thank you. I'm very happy to
Yeah.
hear that.
It's really needed. Every time I talk about it, people are like, that's like a thing, being terrified of vomit to the point of panic attacks. Like there's a name for that. I thought it was weird. And I'm like, no,
Hmm.
you're not weird. Like it's a thing. And it's called emetophobia. And sometimes it happens with OCD. And
Hmm.
it's really cool to like help people learn about themselves when I talk about it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, there's so many places I want to go. I'm glad we have an hour. Um, Can we get into the relationship? Because you obviously see this, I'm sure, with working with families, but I no doubtedly understand the relationship it has to OCD with this idea of restrictive food issues and
Hmm.
limiting, or maybe it's a texture of food. It could be if I eat something I'm afraid I'm going to throw up, that could be
Hmm.
involved in it. It could be only these foods are healthy, I can only eat these things. There's so many reasons. Maybe people are afraid to try a new taste, a new texture, a new flavor. Fill us in on this concept that they call ARFID, what it is, and how it's. Uh, we're hearing a lot more about it. I'm
Yeah.
glad we're talking more about it too.
Yeah. Well, I think I want to fill you in on ARFID, and I also want to talk about pediatric feeding disorders because I don't think
Please,
any
please, please.
discussion about
Yes,
ARFID is complete without that. But so
100%.
ARFID is an eating disorder. It often presents in kids, but it can present in adults too. And there's three subtypes of ARFID. Fear of aversive consequences, which would be like you're afraid you're going to choke or you're afraid you're going to vomit, for example.
Okay.
Sensory ARFID. So that often presents in kids who are neurodivergent, not always. So that would be like you hate the texture of certain foods to the point where you only will eat dry, crunchy foods, and that's it. So like no vegetables, no meat, no fruit, no yogurt, none of that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a limiting of the diet to the extreme. And then also the third subtype is just a disinterest in eating. So this could be medical related. It could be also those who are neurodivergent and struggle with interoception and recognizing their internal hunger and fullness cues. That could be a whole slew of things. And usually someone with ARFID doesn't always exist in one bucket. Sometimes their subtype can like cross over.
Sure.
But when it comes to OCD, that can really be probably more the fear of aversive consequences and the
Yeah.
sensory characteristics, because if OCD often occurs with other neurodivergent things like autism or
Mm-hmm.
ADHD or anxiety, and that can coexist with that fear of consequences. So if you have a kid who throws up and then declines like the types of food that they will eat or the places that they will eat or the situations that they will eat in, to the point where they start to lose weight, rely on supplements, experience malnourishment. It affects their growth. It significantly affects just their like everyday life functioning. That's where we're heading into ARFID therapy, or not ARFID therapy, an ARFID disorder
Yeah.
diagnosis. And so, I mean, that can coexist with OCD, because if we have the fear, like for example, with me, for the fear of vomiting, if that caused me to not eat like out ever because I was like afraid of food poisoning or afraid of going to the bathroom and someone throwing up or whatever, then that could qualify for an ARFID diagnosis.
Gotcha.
But I think there's a lot of knowledge around ARFID in the pediatric feeding space, but there's not as much knowledge about pediatric feeding disorder, which is often a more appropriate diagnosis for kids when there's some sort of like medical things going on. So like if the kid has reflux and it hurts and they have a
Mm-hmm.
hard time explaining that to their parents, and that's why they're not eating, a pediatric feeding disorder diagnosis would be more appropriate, and then addressing like that underlying medical issue. But that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't usually have as much crossover with OCD, I think. So
Yeah, important though. I mean, and again, I want to give you a bit of a platform here to speak about that, because I think for people with OCD, we know that there's perinatal OCD. We know that
mhm.
pregnancy or having a child, even in adoption or fostering, can lead to OCD types of things. And then if something isn't quite going the perfect way with the child, maybe the eating's off or something, that could be another trigger for OCD and stressors, and OCD loves the stressors. So I think it's a very important topic to definitely discuss. So with ARFID, or just for the full, avoidant and restrictive food intake disorder, we have that.
Mhm.
And then we do have some of these pediatric eating issues. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the ways those may manifest, or some things parents ought to look for?
Yeah, I mean, so anytime, I always tell parents, like if meal times are stressful for you, always stressful, or like you think about all the time how you're going to get foods into your kids, that's the point where you deserve help. Like you don't have to like meet XYZ criteria. Like if it's interfering with your ability to effectively parent or is causing a significant amount of stress, like you deserve help with feeding your kids, whether that be like we need to dig into some medical reasons, like how is your kid growing? Is there medical reasons why feeding is challenging, which is often the case. We need to talk about like are there any behavioral things that we can modify? How can we go from mealtime battles to using play and fun at the table to increase the diet variety? And then, when it comes to OCD, that can affect the child's eating, both from OCD in the child and OCD in the parent too. So like if a parent is fearing, their child not getting the right nutrition, or fearing, like you mentioned earlier in the episode, like non-organic food, for example,
Sure.
that can all come into play with feeding the child. So
all of this information is so good for people to learn, because if OCD really does get triggered by stressors, and a child not eating being a stressor for someone, obviously OCD could come in and lead to lots of intrusive thoughts that they might have about that situation.
Yeah. I mean, feeding kids can be really, really hard, and it's one of the things that we do most often with our kids. Like we're doing three meals and 2 snacks every single day. Like that's a lot of time that we spend feeding our kids. So for someone with OCD that's triggered by things around mealtime, that can be really tough to navigate.
And OCD could even jump in and say, what if I'm poisoning my child? What if I'm giving them something that's dirty or bad and I'm causing harm to them? There is, of course, no limit to where OCD will go, or no taboo-ness that it wouldn't go deep into in any way. Mm-hmm. When you're going through having a family, you're going to school, you're establishing this career, and you're doing all of that with OCD, I think that that's always fascinating to people, like in terms of how did you navigate all of that and make space to be able to do things while OCD was always trying to interfere with your ability to get it done?
That's a really good question. And after working with my therapist at NOCD, I keep having these like aha moments. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, that was OCD.
Oh, okay.
Like it happens to me all the time, because like I came into it thinking like, this is my emetophobia. My emetophobia is my OCD. And then like maybe a little bit of like the contamination and hand washing things. But like, I didn't realize like intrusive thoughts, or like, requesting like affirmation for like decision making, or like repeatedly asking questions to my husband, for example, like, are you mad at me? Like that's my OCD popping up. But I didn't know that until I worked with my therapist, because I think you see like movies like The Aviator where they like wash their hands a lot, and you're like, that's OCD. But like the mental component of like the anxiety with decision making and being like paralyzed by decision because I'm afraid of making the wrong decision, that was my OCD popping up. And that would pop up from anywhere from like making travel plans to like deciding on a direction for my PhD research. But I just thought that I was bad at decisions. And so I couldn't really tell you all the details about how it's affected my life up until now, because I think I'm still realizing where it's been popping up. But like, I've realized that it like has even affected my relationship with my husband. And that's something that I'm working on now too. And it's just like all these aha moments are just so great. And it's the mental piece that I think the awareness is more needed for, because people don't realize that if you like spend 8 hours researching a diaper bag to buy for your baby because you can't decide on which diaper bag to buy, like maybe there's something deeper going on there.
Not that you did that or anything, right?
No, of course not. But I did pick a killer diaper bag, so
I bet you did,
it was a good one.
I have seen that. I have treated people who have researched for months, what high chair, what car seat,
Yeah,
what's the safest
exactly.
car to even buy, so that if you are in an accident and your child is in the car, how are they going
Yep.
to be protected?
Right.
And of course, as you probably know, uh, you never quite scratch the itch, do you?
No.
It's
No.
never quite good enough, right?
No. Yeah.
Mm.
And like with the OCD reassurance seeking, it just makes it worse. And I didn't really realize that. Like, and so, I would like ask for reassurance to my husband. And now after going through ERP therapy, like recognizing like the worst could happen. So like, for example, instead of saying like, it's okay, like you're probably not going to throw up. Now he'll be like, yeah, you could throw up. And you would think like that's not being supportive, but actually it's really helpful. And it's just funny to think like from an outsider, what do they think about hearing him say
Yeah,
that? But
yeah.
it's been very an interesting shift.
I think that's why ERP gets a bad rap sometimes, because if you don't understand it, you'll be like,
Right.
that was really jerky. But no, that was maybe the most supportive thing that he could have actually
Yeah.
said to you right there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
You might puke on the plane. I don't know. Yeah, we'll
Right.
see.
Right.
Yeah.
The first time my therapist said that, I was like, well, thanks a lot. But then I was like, okay, she's like practicing what she's preaching here. So
hmm
but,
I
yeah.
really do appreciate you bringing up the relationship piece of it, because
Yeah.
undoubtedly we turn to the people we love the most and almost turn them into part of our compulsions in many
Right.
ways.
Right.
And so it sounds
Totally.
like your husband was drawn in, and no fault of his. He
Hmm.
didn't know either, right?
Right.
It's kind of a natural thing that we bring others in to help us with our compulsions.
Yeah. Yeah. I showed him a paper that my therapist sent me that was like how family members contribute
Hmm.
to compulsions and what to do instead. And I handed it to him. He's like, oh, you're not going to like this.
And you were like, I know. Mhm.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
I
But
know.
I had a really rough patch coming into my first therapy session, just because like my husband threw out his back and we just had so many
Mhm.
illnesses back to back. And so I was like really motivated to deal with my OCD, because it was just like the last thing I needed was like the icing on the cake. And
Oh, of
so
course. Yeah.
I've been very motivated to work on it. And I think that has been a helpful thing too. So
How about in terms of interacting with your children? Does it try to sneak into there also?
yeah, I mean, that was a big reason why my emetophobia
Mhm.
really affects the way that I parent my kids when they're sick, and I don't want it to.
Sure.
So like, for example, my husband would always be the one to get up in the middle of the night with them if they're throwing up. And like, I wanted to be the mom who is like holding them when they're sick versus the mom that's like hiding in my room when they're
Mhm.
sick.
Yeah.
And like, you know, I've heard other parents tell stories like they're holding their kid when they're sick and they like throw up on their shoulder and like they clean them
Mhm.
up and get them back to bed, and like that is like or was my like worst nightmare. Like if
Sure.
my kid is actively throwing up, I would never snuggle them
Yeah.
before this, and I felt bad. I mean, like,
Sure.
he's 3, he wants his mom when he's sick, and I'm
Of
like, get
course.
away from me.
Yeah.
And so that guilt definitely drove me
Mhm.
to want to work on my OCD, because that's not the kind of mom that I want to be.
Yeah.
And so, and things like I would like fear, like when the kid would come home and tell me that their friend threw up,
Yeah.
like my anxiety like just would go through the roof. Or like, one of my kids threw up, and so I'm like living in fear that the next one is going to, or that I'm going to. And so I would be like disinfecting, like keeping them apart to the point where I'm like yelling at them, don't touch your brother, but it's like not a nice way. Like, it would just make me on edge. And like sometimes an illness like can spread slowly. And so it can last like 2 weeks. So it's like 2 weeks of me being constantly on edge with the kids. And I just didn't that was just not the type of mom that I wanted to be. And so that is something that really drove me to seek therapy. And the other day my kids were throwing up and I held my littlest on my lap and I snuggled him. And I was so proud of myself. Like, it seems like a little thing, but I was like, this is like a big milestone for me. Like, he's throwing up and I'm holding him, and it was a good feeling. So
yeah, that's awesome. OCD definitely doesn't care about your values as a parent. It cares about its own values as a condition more than anything else. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I'm thrilled to hear little stories like that where you can hold your child while they're sick, and you can look at yourself and think, look what I'm doing. I'm finally being that mom that I've always wanted to be, instead of the mom that OCD wanted me to be.
Right.
Hide in a closet until everybody is feeling healthy again. Something like that. Yeah. How about on the work side? Does the OCD ever throw doubt and uncertainty into even doing talks and things like that? How about for that?
Yeah. It affected me more. Actually, that's not true. It's affected me in different ways. So like when I was working in the hospital, my first dietitian job, I would be afraid to go into the rooms that the kids were throwing up. Like I would see emesis on the patient chart and I'm like, oh my gosh. And it
emesis, like the technical term for puking, everyone, in case you weren't aware.
So, it's like hard. I would always look at the patient charts before I go in there. And like, I would still go in to talk to them, but it would just be like this anxiety in my chest. And so, that affected me there. I think that had I not had emetophobia, I may have pursued medical school, but I'm sure there were lots of things at play there, but like that, it was something like, I always said I could never be a doctor because people throw up and I don't want to be around people throwing up. Like, it's just a hard no for me. So I think that affected my whole entire career path. And then now as a dietitian on the internet, it doesn't affect me as much, the emetophobia side, but I still have like fear of rejection, fear of like I overthink and overanalyze to the point where it's unhealthy and it's
no hard. One with OCD does that. I don't know what you're talking about.
And having a platform with like, over 350,000 people watching, it like feels like sometimes it magnifies my fears of like saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing because it's like everybody's watching, but I've used my response prevention with that and it's really helped. Like, I just could not believe, like it's something as little as like responding to a comment. If it was like a negative comment from somebody, would like eat away at me for a while. Sure. And I was able to just do it and move on the other day using my response prevention. And it's just amazing, like these little things where I didn't realize it was OCD popping up, and how like a little response prevention statement in my head, like how much of a difference it makes. It sounds like it's not going to be effective because it's just saying like, yeah, something bad could happen. And it's like just that. And it makes a huge difference. I just wish everybody with OCD knew about ERP because it's such an incredible resource to look into.
Yeah. And those comments are always interesting. I have done one talk in my career where every single person gave me a 5 on the talk, and otherwise there's always one who just will make a comment about I didn't like the joke you told, or this was too early and I couldn't stay, focused, whatever. It's and when you're, at least for me, when I was new in the field, man, I would take those to heart. I'd be like, oh gosh, what did I do wrong?
Right.
And now I'm like, okay, all right, I can incorporate that. I could take it. It just, and it's kind of like water on a duck's back in some instances. There will never be 350,000 people listening to you who will all agree with every single word you've ever said.
Right. Yes. I've definitely had to grow a thick skin being on
Yeah.
social media, and it doesn't always work because, I really care about people and I want to
Yeah.
help people, and I really care about my audience and the work that I'm doing. But I've gotten better. I've gotten better at letting the negativity roll off. So.
Hmm. Yeah. How do you see moving forward that now you've been through ERP, you've got these skills? How do you see managing? Because just because you've gone through therapy doesn't mean OCD is not going to try to pop up here and
Right.
there in your life, right? So what do you
Right.
foresee for your future and how you manage it moving forward versus how you used to be able to take care of it?
Well, I feel like going through ERP we've mostly been focusing on my emetophobia. It's like an example for how I can apply it in like everything else in my life. So like, I was thinking like something that really stresses me out on a day-to-day basis is like the bedtime hustle, getting my kids like ready for bed and into bed. And so I tried a response prevention yesterday, and because I would get stressed like if we're not ready for bed on time, like because I struggle with like plans changing, and so in my head like the plan is they're going to be in bed at this time and then I'm going to
Sure.
be able to like do my own thing. And so if the plan changes and they're dilly-dallying and we're late getting ready for bed, then I get stressed out and worked up. And so like I took this response prevention that I use for my emetophobia, like saying to myself, like, yeah, I could throw up, I could get sick, and like used it in this stressful moment with getting my kids ready for bed. Like, we might not make bedtime. They could be dilly-dallying. We could be an hour late to bedtime. Who the heck knows? And like just telling myself that made it so much less stressful.
Yes.
And I was like, where has this been all my life?
Yeah.
So like I'm trying to pinpoint the areas where I get really stressed, or like the things that I want to improve. And a lot of it's been like around regulating myself when I get worked up with the kids. And I think that I can use ERP in a lot of those situations. And so I feel like going through ERP for my emetophobia has taught me how to use that response prevention to manage my anxiety and other parts of my life.
From what I'm hearing, and I love where you went with that, OCD says there's only one option, and response prevention says, nah, there's a lot. There's a lot of options.
Right. And my OCD definitely seeks to like look for certainty, like you said, one option, and like that something good is going to happen. And so you think that like, to better yourself, you need to think positive and like things are going to be great. And in my head, I'm like, everything could be burning to flames. Like it could all go wrong. And you wouldn't think that would be something that's helpful, but it's so helpful.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Welcome to the way the world works. I mean, it happens. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think of myself as a positive person. And so I never really would think like, oh yeah, this could all be horrible. This could all go wrong. But it just helps to kind of manage my expectations a little bit. Yeah.
I think it's even in like marriage vows, we say in sickness and in health, right? We don't just say only healthy marriage will be here. Right. We're open to the idea that there's a broad spectrum of things. We make a vow into something like that. And then OCD says, no, no, that was wrong.
Yes,
Not
exactly.
Before we go, I want to give a little time to advice. This opens you up to a new group of folks who might be wondering, just based on the title of the work you do, how do we grow an intuitive eater, right? What is yes. the best way to do something like that? Yeah.
Oh, that's a great question. There's a lot that we can do. And that's all of that is what I teach in my Growing Intuitive Eaters 101 course, which is free on YouTube. But I think if parents are looking for like an actionable thing to do today, like a takeaway,
Yeah.
A couple pieces of advice I would say is examine the language that you use around food, because language is such a powerful tool. It influences the way you think about food, and it's going to influence the way your kid thinks about food. And it's like, that's going to be the narrative in their head. So if we're telling them that like certain food is bad or good, like we're teaching them to moralize the way that they eat. Or if we're eating this like donut and we're saying like, oh, I'm so bad for eating this, like, then
Yeah.
their kid who also might like a donut might think, well, why is that bad? I like donuts. Am I bad for liking a donut? So I think the way that we talk about food is really important. And so instead of that, using like, I use descriptive, factual words to talk about food. So like, the donut is sweet, it's colorful, it fills my tummy, but it might not stay full for a long time, but it's delicious. And this apple and cheese stick together, that gives me the energy to play at the park for a long time. And it's also really yummy. And the apple is crunchy and it's cold, and the cheese is stringy. And that's the way that I recommend to parents to talk about food. So that's probably number one. And number two, I think parents want to raise their kids to be intuitive eaters, but they also want their kids to like eat vegetables and get the nutrients that they need. And I think using play and fun is the best way to help expose kids to food. Using like low pressure play. So for example, instead of like, if you have a 3-year-old who doesn't want to eat his broccoli, instead of saying, well, you're 3 years old, you need 3 bites before you get down from the table, now we're like placing a demand on them. And in reality, like, the only way that you can enforce that is either like by punishing or consequences, which is a food battle, or like forcing it into their mouth, which is hopefully not going to happen either. So ultimately that child really has control over what goes into their body. And by trying to force something, we're inviting a battle. So I use play. So for example, instead of telling a kid, take 3 bites and then get down, I might say like, guys, let's pretend to be dinosaurs. Do you want to be a dinosaur? Do you want to be a tiger? Do you want to be a bunny? Like, how do you think a dinosaur would take a bite of this broccoli? Like, rawr, I'm going to do it. And that is such a more effective tool. It doesn't invite this power struggle, and it also offers like an opportunity for connection between the parent and child, and it makes the mealtime experience positive overall. So like, I just stitched a girl on Instagram yesterday who was feeding her kid who was pretending to be a cat. And like, I think that's great. If your kid wants to bring pretend play to the table, and it helps them to try and explore new things and make foods more approachable to them, like, do that. Yeah. But the intuitive eating piece would be to do it in a way that's not putting pressure or forcing the child, because ultimately we want them to listen to their own hunger cues when eating. And ultimately we want to give them the control over their own body. And so by using play, we make food more approachable, but also still giving them that power to choose when to eat and when not to eat. So
I suddenly have an urge for broccoli now that you've put up dinosaurs eating broccoli.
If you pretend to be a dinosaur, it makes broccoli a lot more fun.
So I'm going to eat everything from now on. I'm just going to pretend to be a dinosaur. I like it a lot. OCD doesn't just grab onto anxiety. It grabs onto shame and guilt also. And what role does that play in parenting of your children if they have maybe a mental health condition or a physical health condition, or they're not eating, or they're not following what all the baby books said they were supposed to be, or hitting a milestone? And what advice do you have in that area as a parent with OCD and also a specialist in this area?
Yeah. I mean, I'm fortunate that OCD hasn't really affected much of the way I feed my kids, other than maybe some contamination issues, like requiring hand washing when maybe I shouldn't always require hand washing. But beyond that, I can still offer advice speaking from the place of understanding what it's when the OCD brain takes over. I think fearing for your child's safety and well-being is normal, but when it creeps into the point where it becomes like an obsession or compulsion related to the way that you feed your child, it can be really challenging because for many reasons, but we also know that our kids kind of like learn their eating behaviors from the way that we feed them. And so with my OCD, I found that it's really helpful to like get my partner on board with like what my compulsions are, when they might pop up, and how to respond in a way that like doesn't feed the OCD monster. And so like he will say like, this is an OCD thing, like I got it, you need to like step back. And that's been really helpful. And so if you have a partner, talking to them about that and your triggers around meal times to support you, I think is incredibly helpful. I also like hear from a lot of parents, like I am terrified to start solids because I'm afraid my baby's going to choke.
Oh, okay.
Or
Sure.
I'm afraid to, and I don't know if those parents who message me that have OCD or not, but it's a possibility. Or I'm afraid to feed my kid non-organic raspberries because I'm afraid of the pesticides. So I just don't feed them the raspberries at all. So when you have these fears that are affecting the way you feed your child, it's helpful to have that other person in there as a check. And so if you don't have a partner, and if you do, I guess, I think finding a therapist is going to be instrumental, because ultimately your child needs to start solids, and your child needs to have variety in their diet. And if you can afford to give them raspberries, like you should give them raspberries. You should not give them raspberries. And so if it's to the point where it's restricting your child's diet, restricting the way that they eat, I think the best first step is to get support, because that's not just going to magically go away. And feeding them gets harder sometimes before it gets easier, especially if you're in like the throes of toddlerhood. Literally, they're throwing food at you. So, I think the best thing that you can do is take care of yourself, because that will ultimately be the best environment for your kid, is when you take care of yourself and meet those needs that you have.
All right. So I'm gonna challenge you on that one with a last question then.
Yes.
OCD will say taking care of yourself is selfish.
Okay.
How do you manage that? How do you navigate through any message that OCD says to you and live the values you want to live and not the values OCD wants you to live?
Like, how do I personally?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've thought about that. I mean, because I'm a busy mom and working, and like ERP therapy could be time consuming initially.
Sure.
Like I was doing it like twice a week for an hour, and that's a lot when my kids are like not in school for the entire day. Like I'm taking up a big chunk of my time. But I think investing in yourself is investing in like the environment that your kids are going to grow up in. And if you want them to grow up in an environment where they see their parent prioritizing mental health, like I feel like a lot of millennials, and I'm a millennial, grew up in an era where parents didn't really go to therapy as often. It didn't prioritize mental health as kind of like taboo. And now we're prioritizing that. And so like going to therapy and telling your kid, like I told my daughter, my therapist suggested I tell her that I have sticky thoughts. And sometimes it's hard to get these sticky thoughts out of my head. And sometimes they don't make me feel great. And that's why I'm going to talk to my therapist, because she's helping me figure out how to handle that. And I'm really proud that my daughter sees me go to therapy and prioritize that, because I want her to be able to do that if she ever experiences any sort of mental health challenges, because we know that OCD can be genetic. So I want her to like grow up knowing that that's okay. And also, if you're stressed all the time, like it just is a stressed household. And if you can work on that baseline of stress can decrease. And so like your kid's childhood doesn't have to be in a house that's always anxiety filled.
Yeah.
And if it is right now, like, you're not alone. I know what that's like. I've experienced that firsthand. And I just want to send encouragement your way that it's a lot of work and it's not easy. And it can be really scary to like face your biggest fear and like watch videos of your biggest fear and mentally imagine your biggest fear and narrate all the tiny, minute details over and over again of your biggest fear. That's really hard. But it's amazing to see how that helps that fear like dissipate just a little bit. And that makes a big difference. So
Awesome. Well, Dr. Taylor, it has been a joy, and your work with growing intuitive eaters is out there. Where can people find you and get to see your stuff?
Yeah, well, I'm on Instagram at growing.intuitive.eaters. That's where my like short form videos are, and I do stories a lot. So we chat on there, and you can see my day-to-day life. I talk about OCD on my stories pretty frequently. YouTube is where you can find my longer videos. They're all searchable on YouTube. So if like you have a question about feeding your kids, you can search that there. I recently also launched my website, growingintuitiveeaters.com. I have ebooks, downloads, all my courses, resources, blog posts, you name it, it's there. My favorite products. So you can check that out. And then if you're a TikTok person, I'm a Dr. Arnold on TikTok as well.
Fantastic. Well, Taylor, thank you so much for being with me today and participating in the Get to Know OCD podcast. Your story is very inspiring. The work you've done, it was so amazing in the sense that, you know, you're an embodiment of what people with OCD can do. They can live the lives that they want to live and not the life that OCD wants them to live. And so thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And if you liked what you saw today, you can continue to subscribe to the NOCD YouTube channel to watch more of the Get to Know OCD podcast. And if you're looking for a therapist who specializes in the treatment of OCD and exposure and response prevention therapy, and who can get you some amazing results like we talked about today, then check us out at NOCD.com, where we have people waiting to chat with you and to get you started. We are in all 50 states, and we take insurance here in the US, and we also work in other countries. So check us out at NOCD.com. We hope to hear from you soon. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again sometime.